Hello, my name is Dave O'Donoghue from accountancyschool.ie, and the purpose of today's recording is to give you some indication as to which option you should consider taking. If you do want to contact me with any particular questions, there's my contact details there, dave.o'donoghue@accountancyschool.ie. Now, which option? In general, you should look back at your earlier studies, assuming that you've come through the ACCA route. And if you enjoy the likes of F9 financial management, well then you should consider taking on advanced financial management. If you enjoyed your earlier tax studies, or you did well in your earlier tax studies in F6, then you should consider P6. If you did well in F5 in your performance management, but then you should take on advanced performance management in P5. Or if you in your earlier studies enjoyed or did well in F8 auditing, or P2 accounting, because there is a lot of the P2 material which will come into P7, well then you should consider P7. Maybe at that stage you can start crossing out options, because if there's a paper there, for example F9, if financial management just isn't for you, well then there's no reason whatsoever for you to even consider taking on P4. You should also review the last 3 available exam papers, and when you take the last 3 available exam papers for a particular option, have a look at the scenario, the case studies in it. You should be able to understand the terminology in those case studies, because there'll be very little new technical material come up in the option papers. If the case study or the analysis is totally alien to you, well then you should again more than likely stay away from that option paper. So the 2 things to consider firstly is, how did I get on in my earlier studies? And what are the exam papers? What are they like? Can I understand them? Do you think you'd be able to understand the requirements and make some kind of a stab at the requirement? Now, as far as P7 is concerned, then P7 follows on from a number of exam papers. Obviously, it's going to follow on from F8, which is the early audit paper. There's also a P1, in particular the risk part of P1, which will come into the P7 exam paper. When we look at risk in P1, we talk about business risk, and we see business risk arise again in P7. P2 is very important as far as P7 is concerned, because the accounting standard, you need a good working knowledge of accounting standards if you're going to take on P7. So therefore you will need to have studied P2. And there's a small little bit of P3, because we're looking at, in P7, we're often put in a scenario where we're running a business, and we may need to use some of the ideas that we've picked up in P3 in those types of questions, but only rarely. The exam paper itself then is made up of 2 sections, Section A and Section B. Section A is the compulsory part, and there's 2 compulsory questions in it, and you'll be given a significant amount of information, in particular for question 1, but also for question 2. Question 1 is dominated by risk. It's a 35-mark question. It'll be dominated by risk, maybe just business risk, maybe just audit risk, maybe the 2 of them. There are 2 types of risk really. There's business risk and there's audit risk, but then audit risk breaks down into audit risk itself, or risk of material misstatement. In order to attempt business risk, you need a good knowledge of the risk areas you'll have covered in P1. In order to talk about audit risk and or risk of material misstatement, you need a good, strong accounting knowledge. And the risk will dominate question 1. Also in question 1, we might see procedures, and there may be maybe a 7-marker in it as well, where you've got to identify ethical issues which have arisen within the case study. So question 1 for 35 marks tends to be covering those areas. There can be other areas, and there has been other areas in question 1 as well. Question 2 can come from any part of the syllabus. It tends to be dominated by the provision of other services, or by conducting assurance services for clients, or it may be a comment on the matters type question. I'll talk about comment on the matters in a few minutes. Now, with the other or assurance services, it's important to remember that this exam is called P7, Advanced Audit and Assurance. It's not called Advanced Audit. So the examiners try to ensure that in the majority of exam papers, there will be something around the assurance services part of the course as well. So, and if that comes up as question 2, it's a compulsory question. So do keep an eye on the assurance services part of the course. The assurance services part of the course as well will be the main new material that you will see when you're studying P7. The majority of the other material you will have seen before between F8, P1 and P2. But the new material will come from P7, will come from assurance services. Section B then is worth 40 marks. There'll be 3 20-mark questions in it. You'll have to attempt 2 of them. The areas that will dominate Section B will be ethical and professional issues, a knowledge on the accounting standards, looking at audit evidence, and the final stages of the audit process, the review stage, which will often be dominated by audit reporting. So they're the areas that will dominate Section B. Clearly, there can be other areas from the syllabus in there as well. What can the questions look like in Section B? Remembering these will be questions 3, questions 4 and question 5. Each of them are worth 20 marks and you must attempt 2 of them. The first one, the question 3, that can be a comment on the matters question, which I'll mention in a moment. It may be other services or assurance services. So if question 2 was not an assurance service question, it may very well come up then in question 3, as in that it may dominate that question. Or we may have topical issues. Now, when they talk about topical issues in P7, really what they mean is the question will be based on recent articles in the ACCA magazine, student magazine. So you do need to keep an eye on relevant P7 articles which come up on your student magazine. It of course will be the same for all of the other option papers as well. A comment on the matters question. In ACCA, when they ask you to comment on the matters, they don't expect you to come up with issues in the exam paper off the top of your head. They have ideas that they want you specifically to talk about in the majority of comment on the matter questions. And what they want you to talk about is the materiality of the issues in the case study. What are the accounting issues that arise in the case study? What are the risks of material misstatement that come from those risks? And then possibly to also talk about the audit report implications. So when they ask you to comment on the matters, in the majority of cases, they are the issues that they want you to talk about. You then also need to look at evidence, and you need to talk about the evidence you would expect to find when you review the file. The important thing to keep an eye on there is that you're in the shoes of a manager, and that what they're expecting you to do is to review a file and talk about the evidence you'd expect to see on the file. At F8, you'd be a junior person within the audit firm and you'd be carrying out the work. So you'd be asked to list audit procedures you would carry out. In P7, you will generally be a manager or maybe a partner and you'll be reviewing somebody else's work, and you may be critical or raising issues about the work that is being carried out by somebody else. So in F8, you're doing the work. In P7, in a lot of cases, you will be reviewing the work of somebody else. Question 4 is normally around ethics and other professional issues. It's not just ethics that arise in this question. They give you a case study, and from the case study, you've got to identify ethical issues which arise in the case study, and then other professional issues as well. So that would be question 4. Question 5 normally deals with the final stages of the audit, the review stages of the audit, and that will often be dominated by audit reporting. So they're the types of questions that come up. In general, as far as P7 is concerned, it's important to remember that around 85% of the material you'll have already seen through your F8, your P1 and your P2 studies. Don't forget that you must have either studied or passed P2 or be attempting P2 at the same time as you're doing your P7 studies. You will be at a considerable disadvantage if you take on P7 without having already studied P2. P7 requires a bit of knowledge about a lot of things, and then in the exam itself you will find yourself writing a little about a lot of things. The key to passing P7, as the other options, as it is with the other options, is attempting exam standard questions as early as you possibly can. So that really means doing homework and doing mock exams. They become very, very important as far as P7 will be concerned. Just a word then that you have decided that you're going to take on P7. The next thing you must decide is, am I going to do P7 Irish or am I going to do P7 International? The default is that you would do P7 International. You'll only take on P7 Irish if you think at some stage in the future you will require an Irish auditing practicing cert. It's a requirement under UK and Irish law that if you're going to be given an practicing cert, an audit practicing cert under either Irish law or UK law, you must have studied the accounting standards or the accounting implications and the auditing standards of either Ireland or the UK. So there is extra work involved in that. You must already have taken on P2 Irish, and now you would consider taking on P7 Irish as well. The majority of students will take P7 International. Okay, all right. So that's all I have to say really as far as P7 is concerned. If you do have any queries, you can contact me there at dave.o'donoghue@accountancyschool.ie. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you found that of benefit. And all the best with your studies. Thanks very much, and